Support for this episode of Judaism Unbound comes from the Oshman Family JCC in Palo Alto, California, whose vision is to be the architects of the Jewish future. The Oshman Family JCC is an incubator for new expressions of Jewish identity. It creates innovative Jewish learning, celebrations, and arts programs that inspire personal connections to people and ideas from across the Jewish world. Learn more at www.paloaltojcc.org. This is Judaism Unbound, episode 178, I-Wish-I-Had-This-Itis. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Liebenson.
And I'm Lex Rofberg.
And this is part 2 of our interview with Shira Stutman. To remind you, she is the senior rabbi at the 6th and I Historic Synagogue in Washington, D.C., but that title doesn't mean what you think it means. If you want to know exactly what that title is all about and what 6th and I is all about, you should listen to part 1, where we focused more on 6th and I as an organization and on some of the major philosophical ideas that animated its creation and that animate a lot of its work. And as I mentioned last time, in our conversation, there were so many resonances with what Judaism Unbound is all about that we wanted to explore these ideas in a bigger picture sort of way. So we had our conversation go longer and talked with Shira about all kinds of bigger picture philosophical ideas that Judaism Unbound likes to focus on in terms of the Jewish present and future. So since we've already done the major introduction to Shira in our last introduction last week, let me just take this opportunity to thank you all for your support of Judaism Unbound and to ask anybody who's so moved to consider making a small or large financial contribution to Judaism Unbound to help this keep going. Just go to www.judaismunbound.com/donate, and there you can make a one-time donation or sign up to be a monthly supporter of Judaism Unbound, which we appreciate a lot. We always suggest something along the lines of $1 for every episode that you listen to. So if you listen regularly, perhaps you'll consider a one-time donation of about $50 or perhaps a monthly donation of $4 or $5. Thank you so much for all your support. And now we're excited for part 2 of our interview with Shira Stutman.
There's a rumor in DC that when people have a baby, they actually get a letter from 6th and I that says, Mazel Tov on your baby. You may never come back again. And it is so insidious. And I've heard it from, I don't know who's spreading it, but maybe on this podcast we can find out who is. And it's not true. There is no letter. There is no letter. Let me just say that again. But it's complicated. You know, if you're someone who's converted to Judaism or found a Jewish home and you don't want to go anywhere else, to say nothing about the challenge of DC, and that because the city is gentrifying so quickly and there are so many Jewish families moving into neighborhoods where Jewish families haven't lived in large numbers for 50, 60, 70 years, and there aren't synagogues there. For many DC Jews, 6th and I is actually the closest synagogue to where they live by a long shot. And so it's actually not just about their sort of heart connection, it's about their geographical connection as well. And so it's really a challenge.
Well, strategically, I mean, that is an interesting thing to think about long term. Is to say, what would it look like to have a network of organizations that was somehow able to create a path for people so that each organization could really specialize in a particular age or a particular area of interest, you know, and I think that what often happens, at least in my analysis, in the absence of that, is that a lot of funders look at the organizations that are successful, and they're successful because they're actually doing an amazing job of working with one particular niche, whether that's an age demographic or people who love the outdoors or people who hate the outdoors or whatever it might be. And then it works well, and the funder thinks this is the magic bullet. This is going to be for everybody. And then it tries to. Then there's pressure on that organization to grow or to scale or to change their mission. And in many ways, that kind of has the effect, I think, often of losing the magic sauce that organization has really done. And so, you know, what would it look like to have some larger scale view of the possibilities? And I don't know that I want any kind of rich or somehow otherwise, what was the word that you used earlier about that strategic pivoting? You know, I don't want anybody dictating that. So the question is, you know, is there some room for networks of those organizations to get together and try to figure that out and how to strengthen one another?
Yeah, we've been thinking about this a lot. This is really what has given me I'd say 75% of the gray hairs in my head. Israel's given me the other 25%. But we are very lucky in Washington in that we have a number of really extraordinary synagogues in the city. And so, you know, and in the suburbs too, but even just in the city itself. And so luckily that's helpful to us at Sixth and I, because it's like, even when we are transitioning or trying to help people transition, we're transitioning them to some of the best synagogues in the country, and they just happen to be in the city itself. But it's going to sound like I'm just like, have a little bit of an obsession with, like, the evangelical church, but I do a lot of like reading of the evangelical pastors' work. And one of the things I've read a lot about is, how a lot of churches will seed new churches, right? Mm-hmm. So that they will they'll take some of the people from a church. And so we've thought about that a lot at Sixth and I, like, what would it look like? And we're not doing this anytime in the foreseeable future, but like, what would it look like to seed a new synagogue, mm-hmm. right? Like, mm-hmm. so that we would actually we would not have the mission creep. We would stay true to what we are, but yet there would be something in one of those neighborhoods that didn't have a lot of Jewish families for a number of years. And so we are playing with like dozens of different ideas, because, as I said, this really is a unique experiment of like bringing people in, teaching them about Kehillah Kadosha, and then sending the people out. And the closest analog, as you said earlier, Dan, really is Hillel, right? Because people get sent out from Hillel, but in a way that's not, it's the students who leave, right? The students choose to leave. It's not like the Hillel leaves them. And so it's really, it's both, but so we watch how people say goodbye to students at Hillel, and is there anything we can learn from that? And, as we try to figure out what we're going to do as we continue to grow at Sixth and I. Other synagogues can't believe that we consider our greatest goal when we get an email from someone that they're joining, Temple Sinai, or they're joining Temple Micah. But we have the next Lexes who are, coming in for the summer internship and then coming back, and we have to be ready for them.
First off, God forbid that there are more Lexes. Second,
amen.
Yes. That's the universal. Everybody can comfortably say amen to that. Second thing, what you just this idea that it's not about you institutionally, the idea that Sixth and I's success would be measured not so to go back to the idea of butts and seats, so not by whether it's butts and seats or any other metric really of your institution, but by the broader questions of like, are the people that cross your path then in some meaningful way interacting with meaningful Jewishness in the future? I'm being careful not to imply institutional affiliation. Like whether they join synagogues, whether they care about Judaism, whatever the metric is, that's really refreshing. It's not everybody. Really great organizations, by the way, are part of the not everybody. Like there are really great organizations that still ultimately, I think, are operating with metrics that are about whether they institutionally are achieving X, Y, or Z goals, engaging this number of people, doing whatever it is. To hear that whether or not people long after they cross your path do any particular thing, the fact that you care about that is really important. And I'm actually thinking about my own parents. My parents met in DC as in their 20s. I mean, I'm sort of a classic DC story in the sense that they were there shortly, though I know you said that people do stay. But like my parents were there for just a few years. They met each other, then they went elsewhere, and then I existed. So I don't think they did much Jewishly while they were in DC. I don't think they did almost anything. I don't know that for certain, but I don't think they were members of a synagogue. I don't know that they were like proactively doing anything along those lines. I think that they would have if Sixth and I had existed. I'm not saying that to be nice to you. I think that just like for all sorts of practical reasons, its location and the fact that it does do some of these cool lectures, like I think just practically they would have been more likely to end up in your building than in other Jewish buildings in the area. And so I'm thinking about like, but that wouldn't have mattered. What would have mattered is whether after their years in DC, they had been meaningfully shifted. So I guess I'd love to hear from you, like going back to that thing you said a while ago about how is this good for the Jews writ large? You were talking about, having one place for all the young adults in the community to gather. And even if that poaches, I'm using a provocative verb, even if it poaches from some congregations, like it might be worth it. Like say more about that, about this broader, is it good for the Jews? Is it good for humanity set of questions?
Well, first I'll begin with some of the challenges. Like one of the challenges of that is it's really hard to measure, right? How do you measure these metrics? It's much easier to measure Sixth and I's success by saying how many people come a year, How many people come more than once? How many people become donors? And so it's more of a challenge to measure sort of how someone behaves a few years out. And remember, religious programming at 6 and I, substantive religious programming is only about 10 years old. So a lot of our families are really only starting to sort of get to the place where we would want to see where they are and what Jewish life looks like for them. But I guess part of our gamble is that we are only one part of a much larger ecosystem. And our job is to really help carry and love and educate and stand with young professionals in a certain stage of life. And then it'll be someone else's job, God willing, to take them for the next stage of their life. I know you use the word poaching is not a great word. And while we certainly didn't do what sometimes Chabad does do, which is like stand in front of another institution and like actually bring people, I do know that there were other groups that sort of were made smaller because 6 and I existed. But how can it not be better for the Jewish community that we're able to bring in, we have 19,000 visits a year, different than visitors, 19,000 visits a year just from young professionals doing Jewish young professional programming, right? We have 80,000 visits a year from everyone. And how can it just not be better for the Jewish people to have those 19,000 visits rather than 19 or even 190 in smaller organizations? And it's also about being around difference as well, right? And so one of the things 6 and I is able to do, complicated when it comes to the politics part of that, we can discuss it separately, but we are able to have lots of people together so you can find your smaller community, your smaller subgroup, but also be part of a wider community as well of people who are generally around your age range. And also think about the average experience of the average 30-year-old who steps into the average synagogue, even very successful ones, on a Shabbat morning or a Friday night. Whenever we have people who are like trying out the next place, and especially when we were first experimenting with this, at first they would come back to 6 and I would say, how was it to go to, Shir Tikva? I said, did anyone talk to you? And to a person, what the young people would say is the same thing. They'd say, oh yeah, everyone talked to me. Every single person there came up to me and said, hello, we're so excited to have a young person here. Who are you? Where are you from? Do I know your aunt? Do I know your uncle? They play Jewish geography. So, at first we thought no one would talk to them, but instead it's like every synagogue is sort of, they're desperate for these young people. And I do think that if more synagogues focused on their core groups, whether it's young families or, God forbid, if a few of them would just focus on baby boomers, which is an extraordinarily large contingent of Jews who also, turns out, still need their own spiritual sustenance, then we really could have a more vibrant community instead of synagogues investing in groups that they don't have the expertise in and that they're not going to get a tremendous number to show up in any case.
So 2 short questions that each potentially could be very intricate answers. First off, what's your relationship to membership? How does 6 and I do or not do membership? I'm curious to hear on that front, because we've talked to some organizations that very actively do have members and very actively don't do membership on both ends of the spectrum. So curious where you're at on that. And also, when you look out at the Jewish communal ecosystem, one thing we've talked about is should we understand the closing of synagogues or certain institutions as a tragedy, or like how do you orient to the question of institutions that may just need to close?
For the good of the Jewish people, some organizations, some synagogues, they just need to close. But I do think it's hard if it's your organization. Right. You don't want your organization to be the one that closes. You want it to be the one down the street. And so, I think once upon a time it was the federation system that would have had enough of enough political capital in the community to be able to bring together people around the table and figure out how the community needed to shift. But I think the federation system is a critically important system in the Jewish community. But I'm not convinced if many federations have the ability to pull together the Jewish community to talk about what organizations need to close. But I do think that that real estate is often quite an albatross for a lot of synagogues. Because most of them are empty 98% of the time. And so then you're just stuck with the upkeep of a building that's not being used. And that was one of the brilliances of 6th and I. It was a brilliance, but also we are in DC, right? we are in a place where people want to come when they are on book tour. And so if you are in, rural Indiana, no one's going to want to come to that synagogue when you're on book tour. The other innovation that Six and I really capitalized on was this idea of changing the financial model, changing the business model of what it means to be part of a synagogue. And so, yes, we rely on donors like a lot of synagogues do, and we rely heavily on donors like a lot of Hillels do, but we also rely on earned income. There is no membership at Six and I. You can't become a member. You could become a monthly donor, and we would love your money, don't get me wrong, but you can't become a member. And so what we do is we make money off of our book talks, not as much as people think we do, but we make a little bit. We make a little money off of our concerts. And we make money off, well, we don't lose as much money as some places do off of our religious programming, right? So if you want to come to services tend to be free. Not always, but usually. But if you want to come to dinner after or kiddush after, you have to pay. If you want to come to a class, you have to pay. And so we are trying to change a little bit of the conversation of what does it mean to pay into a system. It's a little bit more American than I would like, right? So I do feel like the Jewish model is more about paying into the system, not just to the things you're actually partaking of yourself. But it does help us keep Six and I alive and afloat and nimble also, right? We are able to make changes if we see that we are doing things that are not relevant to the community. Rachel Nussbaum is the rabbi of Kavanah out in Seattle, and we were at some Jew conference together. I forget which one of the many it was, and someone said something about an endowment, and Rachel said, and I'm paraphrasing her, so if I don't get it correctly, it's totally my fault, but she said something like, well, I don't think we're going to start an endowment at Kavanah, because when it's time for Kavanah to be done, let's just let it be done. And when I heard that, it was just it's like my brain exploded, right? Imagine a synagogue saying, you know what? We don't need an endowment. When the synagogue's not working anymore, we're just going to close down. I can't imagine many organizations doing that. And that is a certain kind of nimbleness that I really admire. And the recognition that there's a certain time and a certain place for many different organizations. And sometimes knowing that your time has passed doesn't mean that the time that you had wasn't important.
On the endowments point, I would, as you listen to this, listeners, this is in the show notes on the website. There's some great scholarly work on the history of endowments in Jewish life, and they were not taken for granted always, and they were actually deeply questioned for a long time on moral grounds, to be honest. And there's a lot of interesting work on that, largely by Lila Corwin Berman, a past guest of ours, and that's in the show notes. Some of those links. I want to address something that's always a fear of mine with the podcast, which is the disease that I call I-Wish-I-Had-That-Itis. I-Wish-I-Had-That-Itis, which is I am constantly nervous, and this isn't it's not really a disease, but this isn't a terrible inclination, but I'm constantly nervous that listeners will listen and hear about an organization like Sixth and I, and the main takeaway will be, ugh, I don't have that where I'm listening. I wish I had that. Bummer. And to me, look, I understand that, and maybe it is true that there are places in the universe where something like Sixth and I in any form couldn't exist. But I really want to push and say there is a version of this. Look, I've lived in Jackson, Mississippi. I've lived in places with very few Jews. I want to push and say there is a kernel of something here that people can apply pretty much wherever they are. And what I want to ask you is, what's the kernel? If somebody's listening and they're thinking to themselves, sounds amazing, yeah, I don't have it, bummer, yeah, what would you suggest to them?
Oh my God, I love this question so much, because we get this question at Six and I all the time. I get if we had Six and I in my city, I'd go to synagogue. And I'm like, yeah, okay.
I was just thinking that.
I love it. Oh, really? For you, Dan, it's true. But for everyone else, it's just Lex, you're so right. So here are the things that anyone could have. Anyone could create an authentically welcoming environment. And by that, I mean one where, I'm going to say it again, what I said before, and I always go to what I see as the biggest third rail issues in the Jewish community. Any synagogue from Jackson, Mississippi to Washington could be a synagogue where there are some people who are Israel right and wrong, and some people who don't believe that Israel needs to be a state for the Jews, right? We might choose not to do that, but anyone could do that. Anyone could have a synagogue where they have couples, like one of the 6 and I couples that had a bristism for their child, right? And maybe they wouldn't hold the bristism on the bima during Shabbos services. That's a combination of a bris and a baptism for those who didn't get, right? Maybe, but yet that the couple could still feel like that their synagogue is their home, right? Any synagogue, any community in America could do that. Some might choose not to for really good reasons again, but it's possible. Any synagogue could have workshops for interfaith couples like we do. Any synagogue could have a vibrant conversion class. Like, that's done. Okay. The other thing that any synagogue could do, and we haven't even talked about davening. We talked about like the mechanics of the different services, but we didn't talk about the goal of the davening community that we're trying to build at Six and I, even in all the different services. But any synagogue could have services that make people cry and laugh and dance and actually feel something, right? When we are planning our services at Six and I, we think about every single minute of the service. And so any synagogue could do that if the clergy and the congregants, it's not just the clergy and it's not just the congregants, actually care. Any synagogue can be a place where you can have secular conversations in addition to, and again, we're using that bifurcation that we don't like so much, but sort of secular conversations in addition to the Jewish ones. So I do think that like this sort of wish I had this itis is, I'm not saying it's not true. It is very true to people, but there is a piece of it that is, oh, I wish someone else would create this. I wish someone else would do this. And it's not someone else. Like, it's you. You're the one. You'll do it.
I want to go back to starting from what we were talking about earlier in terms of evangelism and conversion and all that. And I think it goes further afield than that. But fundamentally, I've thought for a long time that if Judaism is really good, then why would it only be limited to Jews? Like, that seems absurd. And so then I ask, well, why are we allergic to things like evangelism and conversion? So number one, it's historically, okay, if we were oppressed and it would seem, it'd be very bad for us in Christian Europe if it seemed like we were out there trying to convert people to Judaism, that's totally understandable. But it feels like it's gone beyond that, and maybe that was the original reason for it or whatever, but it feels like now, for a lot of people, I think it comes from a deep-seated sense that Judaism's not that good, that the only reason why we're Jewish is because our parents were, we grew up, I don't know, it's some shtick of my family, but I can't really convince anybody else. So therefore, if somebody else is out there trying to evangelize, I'm suspicious of that person, that they must be just in it for the money or whatever, because I know that Judaism isn't really something that's worthy of evangelism. Now, that may or may not be true descriptively of the Judaism that of all kinds of forms of Judaism that we have around. But it feels to me that at least aspirationally, right, I want there to be a Judaism that's worthy of my time. And if there's a Judaism that's worthy of my time, then I assume that it would be worthy of the time of a lot of people who are like me. So I assume that once we got to the question of, is Judaism worthy of my time, that the question of evangelism, conversion, being totally open to anybody, no matter what your background is genetically, almost seems like an obvious point to me. And so I guess my question is two-part. One is to the extent that you think that Judaism is already there. Can you talk about that a little bit? Or to the extent that you see, especially from the perspective of young people, kind of what do we need to do in order to get Judaism to that place would be really interesting to me. And then this question of, I guess from having worked with young adults for the last 10 or 15 years in this way, can you talk a little bit about what you think the unmet needs of young adults out there in the working world, in the political world of DC, are already that seem to be driving them to take an interest in Judaism? What is it that they're finding there that they're needing? And that and I think maybe in the connection between those two questions is this agenda for some of the work that we need to be doing on Judaism.
Oh, gosh. First of all, I love that. I wrote down, is Judaism good or not that good? That's like the title of a high holiday sermon right there. I haven't even talked at all about my deep and abiding and ongoing love for non-Jewish partners. Because I think, and again, I'm saying this partially flippantly, but mostly with every bone in my body, I understand the challenges of intermarriage. I really do. I've read every single piece of research, and I know that it's complicated. I also want to say that in my working life and rabbinate, I come from a family, there are 6 kids in my family system, and I'm the only one married to someone Jewish. So it's personal for me, but it's also in my professional life. I think non-Jewish partners are one of the greatest blessings to liberal American Jews, because they're the ones who remind us that Judaism is that good, right? I do think that a lot of the born Jews, and it's not their fault. It's because the Judaism that they were taught at Hebrew school was just so vapid. It's not even the Hebrew school teacher's fault. It's the system. It's the ecosystem's fault. This is really, I don't want to make this a blame in any way, but just there's this one line from a spiritual autobiography. We have in our conversion class, all the students have to write spiritual autobiographies. And one of the Jewish partners who took the class, he wrote this line. He grew up Jewish. He had a bar mitzvah. He was confirmed. And he wrote, I knew enough to know that I was supposed to go to synagogue on Friday nights, but I never had any idea what to do once I got there. And so I do think that a lot of Jews don't realize the beauty that is part of our tradition. Now, some of it is our own internalized anti-Semitism and our own sense of trauma. All of that is true. It's all true. But some of it is that, the average Jew in the pew, they show up, first of all, at best, only for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. So they get one type of theology, and it's not the most welcoming in of all the Jewish theologies that we have out there. Their experience of good Judaism is almost entirely nostalgia-based. Remember, nostalgia is something that actually never really happened that way in the first place, but we remember it as happening that way, so it's entirely problematic. And they just don't have any experience of what a lived Jewish life can be until they start dating this non-Jew, and they say to the non-Jew, look, I want to have Jewish kids. And the non-Jew's like, okay. Then the non-Jew says, all right, if we're going to have Jewish kids, then we should, go to synagogue. And what does the Jew say? Oh, no. We don't need to go to synagogue, right? Or the non-Jew will say, well, maybe we should light Sabbath. No. We don't need to no. And so what the non-Jew will bring into the relationship, into the conversation is well, if there's no beauty in Judaism, then I'm going to raise my kid nominally, whatever. Why? And then the conversation can really begin about what does make Judaism beautiful. Where are the pieces that can be additive to anyone's life? If you want to do a great podcast, you should do a podcast with all of our converts who are single and have to go out on first dates with Jews. And the stories they have to tell, it's I don't want to say every, but the number of times I've heard stories where it's a first date, right? They're like, okay, Cupid. And the born Jew is like, why would you want to be Jewish? Why did you convert? That's so ridiculous. How could you want to be Jewish? And so then, the convert has to then spend their whole time defending this choice. It's so crazy. And it's totally unsurprising to me. It's totally unsurprising. So I do think that there is a way that the average American Jew doesn't understand that Judaism is not just about oppression and Holocaust. It's also about beauty and joy and vulnerability. And one of the things non-Jewish partners do is sort of force the question in a really important way. So it's not just the converts, it's also non-Jewish partners. Which sort of brings me to the second question you were asking, which is sort of what is it that young professionals specifically need and want for this, in their world? And I do think, and maybe this is DC specific, DC is the community I know, so forgive me. As I said earlier, there is a tremendous amount of loneliness. People in Washington are very busy. They are busy from the second they wake up, they take a run, they walk the dog, they do their yoga, they go to work, they work 12 hours, they go to a networking event. They don't get home until 11:30 at night. But in between, there's no place that they ever went deep. There's no place that they ever sat with someone and just stared into their eyes. And so what we are able to do at Sixth and I is we are able to provide sort of a space for Jewish practice that our people can just lean against like a tree, and just sort of be quiet for just a second and know that they will be loved no matter what. And this is, 20s and 30s for many people, not everyone, but it's a time where they are looking for and then finding a life partner. And so there are a lot of questions about what is our life going to look like together? We're dealing with a lot of, when people imagine what their life partner is going to be, they imagine someone basically exactly like them. And then you actually find the person and you realize there's always a lot of work to be done. And so one of the things we help do is help, couples figure out sort of what it means for them to choose to be together. So there's just a tremendous amount of identity formation and growth that happens during this time period. And I'll say one last thing, some people, of course, have family systems that are functional and that they could lean against when they need it. But sometimes in DC, either those family systems are very far away, or they really aren't as functional or functional in the way that you want them to be. And one of the things we're able to do at 6 and I is create like an extended family for a lot of people who can be siblings and cousins and advisors to each other, and just sort of just help them along.
So I have a homework assignment for everybody listening who speaks in front of rooms of Jews and others. Say that you have an unabiding love for non-Jewish partners in the next few weeks. Find a time where you can say that, because what just happened, like in my body when you said that, was incredibly healing. As somebody who has a non-Jewish partner, I'm not even the non-Jewish partner, by the way. And honestly, it may have, if Valerie were listening, like it may have hit me in a deeper way than it did her. I suspect that actually, but like it is so important to hear those words from somebody with no caveats, with no comma buts afterwards. It is special. So that's number one. Carrying that forward, I spend a lot of time, and this is not a critique of you, it's just I spend a lot of time thinking about how when we think about non-Jews in Jewish spaces, we tend to think about partners of Jews, but for all the reasons that you just said, there's a lot of people who aren't that form of adjacent to Jewish, but other forms of adjacent to Jewish, who really like Jewish things and end up in Jewish spaces. Yep. And so my piece that sort of feels tragic to me is I'll tell people that I have a Seder. I've had a Seder the last couple of years. On like the 5th or 6th night. I do one after the first ones because you need a little break. But I don't do 2. I do 1 the first night and then I take a break and then we do one like the 5th or 6th. And it's like 75% people who aren't Jewish. And then a few people who, and by the way, I don't like count out when Val and I are inviting people. It's just like we happen to spend time mostly with people who aren't Jewish. And so we invite our friends. Yeah. And so first off, those Seders are incredible. They're like unambiguously incredible. And I think, by the way, not only do I enjoy them, like I think if some outside observer were to, like questions come up that don't come up in my experience in Seders where most of the room is Jewish. People don't take things for granted. When you're talking about the plagues, when you're telling parts of the story that you've heard a bunch of times, or that I've heard a bunch of times, there's people in the room that have never heard that before, and for whom it's entirely new. And so they ask things that just for me, I don't even think to ask. I'm trying to think of a good example. I don't have them, but like there's pieces of the rhythm of the Seder that so we wash our hands twice. Like, so what? Why? Like, what? There's not really a reason offered. I mean, like, my answer is because we want to confuse the children and make them ask that question and build this spirit of asking questions in the Seder, which is a pretty traditional answer, actually. But like, when you have spaces for getting partners that are just diverse spaces that are very Jewish spaces. Like I'm talking about a Passover Seder ultimately. Yeah. I think that something powerful can happen. So I'm curious, I don't know actually if you have regular gatherings or spaces that are like majority not Jews or like really, really hefty portions of the room being folks who are not Jewish and not partners of Jews. But if you have those practical examples, that'd be great. But if you don't, like more generally, what would you say about sort of the next level beyond partners, but others who are just adjacent to Judaism in one other respect?
I want to add something to the I-Wish-I-Had-This-Itis, like that list that we made or we might be about. I would add to the Wish-I-Had-This-Itis. Any synagogue can be a space where you feel welcomed in, whether or not you're Jewish, whether or not you're not Jewish and partnered with a Jew or not. Like any synagogue can be that sort of space, because I think what you're articulating is incredibly important for a few different reasons. First of all, going back to what Dan was saying before and what we've been talking about before, if we do believe that Judaism has something to give to this world, why wouldn't we want to share it with the word non-Jew is problematic. I get that as well. It's a complicated word, but why wouldn't we want to share that with everyone, including people who themselves are not Jewish? And so I agree. Anytime I lead a service, as I said, I assume that a number of people there are not Jewish, and not just people who are partnered with Jews, just people who sort of came in off the street, or who are just interested in Judaism, or who are interested in spirituality. I mean, the number of meetings I've had with people who are like, well, I work a few blocks away, so I thought or of course, the number of people we have who grew up Catholic and are looking for a new faith tradition. That's a whole other complex part that we can talk about another time. But all the time, we have people in our community who are not Jewish. And of course, sometimes we have people who are practicing multiple faiths at the same time, which is a whole other ball of wax. But I do think that because Judaism has something to offer to this world, and we are living in such a 21st century syncretic, open-minded, where Jews are the most liked religion in America right now, according to the Pew Forum. Now, that's a little bit complicated because of evangelicals and the reasons they like, but in general, the Jews are the most liked religion in America. I'll just take that statistic. So people are interested in Judaism, even people who are not Jewish themselves. And then here's my favorite story about what you were talking about, Lex. I married a man 21 years ago who grew up Jewish, but his parents were Jewish. He was Christmas tree. And by the time we got married, we were having our and he was our wedding celebration, and he was going to give the Devar Torah, the sermon in our wedding celebration. And the Torah portion was the portion called Balak. It was just 21 years ago at this point. He wrote this Devar Torah, this little sermonette, and I read it and I gave it back to him. I was like, yeah, but this doesn't work because whatever you were trying to prove, Rashi says the opposite. And he said, who's Rashi? And I said, no. I mean, let me explain to you how Judaism works. Rashi is a very important rabbi, and you can't go against Rashi. And he goes, why can't I go against Rashi? And I'll never forget that moment. All of a sudden I was like, oh yeah, why can't he disagree with Rashi? It had never occurred to me that someone would be able to disagree with Rashi. And I do think when you now my husband happens to be ethnically Jewish, but this is exactly what you were talking about, Lex, in terms of your Seder. When you bring people who don't carry the have-tos, this is how we've always done it, oh, isn't this boring? Or they just carry a sense of curiosity about it that is really just changes the energy. It shifts the energy in such an intense way that it can even make the Jews excited, not always, but it could even sometimes make the Jews excited all over again about this tradition that they already are lucky to be a part of.
Well, so I think in the interest of time, we're going to be wrapping up this extraordinary conversation, but I think I have a way to bring it full circle, which is
awesome.
Which is the following. Following up on everything that you've been talking about, I've been thinking a lot about from the beginning of the podcast and talking about how so many of the early rabbis were people of questionable Jewish genetic heritage. Let's put it that way. Were they Jewish, not Jewish, sort of Jewish? On the Jewish spectrum somewhere, or any other sort of possibility. A lot of those early rabbis were in that category, and I would imagine a lot of the Jews living at that time were in those categories. And to my mind, that's no accident, sort of for all the reasons that you were talking about in terms of when you're in a time of transition like that, how those are exactly the people that you want to have involved, because they're going to be able to see things that we don't see, or they don't have the nostalgic attachment to things that we actually need to let go of, etc. And it also makes me think of when I was researching for this conversation and I saw you somewhere talking about what it means to have women rabbis, and that once you have women rabbis, the thing isn't going to be the same anymore. And that's a good thing. And, part of me, well, I think that part of the role of this podcast is to pull the curtain open and to reveal some of the inner workings of these transitions. There's another piece of it that people also want to have this sense of continuity and don't necessarily want to see all of those machinations and just want to feel that they're connected to what has come before, even if we know that it was profoundly different from what came before, and that we know that in some ways what I think was going on during the transition from biblical Judaism to rabbinic Judaism is that biblical Judaism had already ended, but people weren't exactly saying so, and they were sort of trying to live in some way to say, yeah, we're really doing the same thing. And I guess the full circle of it is that I'm thinking of Esther Safran-Foer, who I consider a strategic person, and that point that you wanted to be the chief spirituality officer or whatever, and she said she wanted you to be the rabbi. And I'm wondering if that was some of the motivation to say, that, yeah, we do want to do all this adventurous stuff, and at the same time, we want to make sure that people feel the sense of being connected to the tradition, being held by a certain category, and I guess I'm wondering about that specific question, but I'm also wondering if you could sort of in this closing reflect on that balance between of knowing that we have to be extremely adventurous, of knowing that our community is full of all kinds of people and certainly in positions of influence that were never there before. And of course, the whole thing is going to change as a result of that. And yet, as Elie Wiesel would say, and yet we have to also, it's also valuable to emphasize that connection to the past.
I love this as a last question because I get to be like very Reconstructionist as I answer, so I can sort of pay homage to Mordechai Kaplan and the movement as it. I don't know, what do we call ourselves a movement anymore? But
I think it's now a gerund.
Okay.
Yes, reconstructing.
Right. Sorry. That implies that assumes I know grammar. But anyway, it's a different conversation. But I think, look, throughout all of Jewish history, what the Jews have done in every place we've lived is we've taken from the cultures that we are part of, right? And we bring what we learn to Judaism, to Torah, and to the sort of thread of Jewish teaching and learning that goes all the way back to Sinai. We have a bunch of one-liners that we use at Sixth and I, and one of them is the Torah can take it. And what we mean by that is that when you take the Torah out of the ark, right? You've both seen this before. You take the Torah out of the ark and you're holding it and everyone's like, don't drop it, don't drop it, don't. We treat our Torahs with much more, we're much more careful with our Torahs than we are with our infants, in this way that is at once beautiful, but also kind of problematic. The Torah, and by this I mean Torah with a capital T and a lowercase t, has endured for thousands of years because Jewish tradition and teaching has at its core teachings about justice, about holiness, about compassion, about community that are true, right, with a capital T at their core. And so the Judaism that we are teaching is the same Judaism that has always existed with some American touches added on. And they're really additive. They don't take away. I'll give you a story about what we did last year, the evening of Yom Kippur. And one of the things that happens on the opening of Yom Kippur is we say this prayer called Kol Nidre, and we repeat it 3 times, which is very good because I had this idea. What happens is you take the Torahs out of the ark, and someone is holding them on the bima, on the pulpit, while we're singing this Kol Nidre prayer. And I was thinking to myself, okay, so we have this line at Sixth and I that's called the Torah can take it. So what does it mean that the Torah can take it? What does it mean physically, right? We are an embodied people. We go into the mikveh to convert. We eat matzah. We sit in the sukkah. We do everything we do. We try to do with our spirits. We do with our bodies. So I think, how can we embody this idea that the Torah is so strong and enduring that we can bring to it all of the beauty and challenges of the messy, chaotic American Jewish community, and it can only be additive? So I decided at that moment that after we finished the Kol Nidre prayer, instead of putting the Torah back in the ark, we were just going to pass it around the room. And we were going to pass it from person to person to person for the rest of the night. Because what's the worst thing that happened, right? The worst thing that happens is someone drops it, right? And then we figure it out next. And so over the course of the rest of the evening, it just got passed around the room and people held it and some cried and some couldn't get rid of it fast enough, right? And some people were uncomfortable and some people, it was the first time they had ever held the Torah, and some people were Jewish and some people were not, and some people ran out to get a talis and some didn't. And it was just like such a perfect encapsulation of what we're trying to do at Sixth and I, and God willing in 21st century Judaism, which is give Torah to the people. Trust the people that they can take the teachings and the learning of Torah and use it to build meaning in their lives. And that when the time is right, they'll also give Torah back to us. The Torah can take it, and so can we.
Thank you so much, Shira Stutman, for joining us. This has been a fantastic conversation.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
And thanks, of course, also to all of you out there listening. We hope you've enjoyed this 2-part episode, and we hope that you'll tune in again in the future. We want to close out this episode in the same way that we always do, by encouraging you to be in touch with us. And there are a wide variety of ways for you to do that. First, you can head to our Facebook page, Judaism Unbound. Second, you can go to our website, judaismunbound.com. Third, you can check us out on Twitter at Judaism Unbound. And last but not least, you can hit us up via email at dan@judaismunbound.com or lex@judaismunbound.com. The last request we like to make is that we really deeply appreciate any amount of financial donation that you're able to send our way. And you can do that on a monthly recurring basis or just as a one-time gift at judaismunbound.com/donate. So thanks so much for listening. And with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.